It was a bright and peaceful afternoon, and Mr. Thomas, a retired teacher, was enjoying his cup of tea while reading the newspaper. His loyal German shepherd, Bruno, sat nearby, keeping him company as always. Bruno had been Thomas's companion for years, a calm, intelligent dog who rarely misbehaved. But today something felt different. As Thomas stood up to check on the mail, Bruno suddenly bolted to the hallway, positioning himself firmly at the foot of the stairs. His ears were sharp, his body stiff, and his intense gaze was fixed on the closed door of the attic room. "Bruno? What's wrong, boy?" Thomas asked, puzzled by the unusual behavior. When Thomas tried to walk past him, Bruno growled softly, not in anger, but as if he was issuing a warning. Thomas froze. He couldn't recall the last time Bruno had growled at him. His heart began to race, and a chilling unease crept in. That attic door hadn't been opened in years, not since his late wife had passed. It was mostly filled with old belongings, things he had tucked away to avoid reopening old wounds. But why was Bruno acting this way now? What was behind that door? As Thomas stood there, caught between his own curiosity and the unsettling atmosphere, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Bruno was protecting him from wasn't ordinary, and whatever lay behind that door was about to change everything. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath Thomas's hesitant steps. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting golden patterns on the walls, but it did little to ease the tension in the air. Bruno stood like a statue at the base of the attic stairs, his deep brown eyes locked on the closed door above. His posture was tense, ears flicking at the slightest sound. Thomas could feel his heart beating faster as an unfamiliar unease settled over him. This was his home. Every corner, every creak, every shadow was familiar. Yet, in this moment, it felt different, foreign, as if the house itself was holding its breath. A strange draft seemed to seep from the attic door, despite no windows being open. It carried with it a faint, musty smell that tugged at Thomas's memory but offered no clear answer. He took a step closer, but Bruno let out a low, rumbling growl. Thomas paused, gripping the banister tightly. His mind raced. Was it an animal that had somehow gotten inside? Or was it something else? The atmosphere was thick with suspense, each second stretching longer than the last. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like a stranger in his own home. Whatever lay beyond that attic door wasn't just locked away by wood and nails. It was hidden beneath layers of emotion, secrets, and something he couldn't yet name. "Bruno," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "What are you trying to tell me?" As he stood there, the unease deepened, and he realized there was no turning back. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. Thomas was a man of quiet habits, a retired teacher who found joy in small things. Gardening, reading, and spending time with his loyal dog, Bruno. For years, Bruno had been his companion, his shadow in times of loneliness. The dog had an uncanny sense of when Thomas was troubled, always offering comfort with a nudge or an affectionate wag of his tail. Thomas lived alone in the house he grew up in, a place filled with memories of his parents and his younger sister, Emily. Emily had always been adventurous, the polar opposite of Thomas's reserved nature. She had left home years ago, leaving him as the caretaker of both the house and the legacy of their childhood. He often thought of her, especially when he ventured into the attic. That space held the relics of their shared past, dusty photo albums, her old journals, and boxes of forgotten trinkets. But despite his fond memories, the attic was a place he avoided. It carried a weight he couldn't explain, as though the air grew heavier every time he neared it. There was an old lock on the door, a lock placed there years ago after an unexplained incident. Thomas's parents had forbidden them from going up there, and even after their passing, he had never removed it. Bruno, on the other hand, had always been curious about the attic. Whenever Thomas climbed the stairs to dust or check on things, Bruno would follow closely, sniffing the air with an alertness that seemed almost human. Thomas himself wasn't one for mysteries. He preferred the predictable rhythm of his life, but beneath his calm exterior was a man still haunted by questions. Why had his parents locked the attic all those years ago? Why did Emily always avoid talking about it? As the afternoon light filled the room, Thomas studied Bruno, who stood firm at the base of the stairs. The dog's unusual behavior had been unsettling for weeks now. Bruno had been growling softly at night, pacing around the house, and today, he had outright blocked Thomas from entering the attic. Thomas sighed, his fingers brushing against the old key he kept in his pocket. A key to the attic door. His parents had given it to him before their passing, urging him to leave the attic alone unless absolutely necessary. But what could be so important, so dangerous, that it remained hidden for decades? Bruno, Thomas murmured, crouching to scratch behind the dog's ears, "You've always been my protector. But what are you protecting me from now?" As Bruno's growl deepened, Thomas's mind raced with thoughts he had long suppressed. He knew it was time to face whatever secrets the attic held, no matter how unsettling they might be. Thomas stood at the foot of the attic stairs, Bruno's growl echoing softly in the quiet house. His loyal companion was blocking his path, staring up at him with a mixture of urgency and unease. The key in Thomas's hand felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of decades of secrets. For years, he had avoided the attic, content to let the mysteries of the past remain buried. But now, Bruno's unusual behavior left him with no choice. "All right, Bruno," Thomas said, his voice steady but uncertain. "I don't know what's going on, but we'll face it together." As he climbed the creaking stairs, Bruno hesitated at the base, whining softly. Thomas paused and looked back, motioning for the dog to follow. "Come on, boy. You've brought me this far. Don't leave me now." With a reluctant bark, Bruno trotted up behind him, his body tense and alert. The attic door loomed before them, its old wood scratched and weathered. The lock was rusty but intact, a relic of his parents' firm command to never open it. Thomas slid the key into the lock, his hands trembling slightly. With a loud click, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. Sunlight streamed through a small, dusty window, illuminating the cluttered space. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, draped with cobwebs. An old rocking chair sat in the corner, its wood cracked and splintered with age. Thomas stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for anything unusual. Bruno stayed close to his side, his ears perked and his growl low and steady. At first glance, the attic seemed like nothing more than a repository of forgotten memories. But as Thomas ventured deeper, he noticed something strange. A circle of candles on the floor, long since melted down to stubs. In the center of the circle lay an old wooden box, its surface etched with intricate carvings. "What is this?" Thomas whispered, crouching down to examine the box. His fingers traced the carvings, which seemed to form symbols he didn't recognize. Bruno barked sharply, his body stiffening as if warning Thomas to stay away. Ignoring his own unease, Thomas opened the box. Inside was a collection of items that sent a chill down his spine. A lock of hair, a small vial of what appeared to be blood, and a photograph of his parents holding a baby. But it wasn't him or Emily. The baby in the photo had piercing blue eyes and a face Thomas didn't recognize. "Who is this?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. He flipped the photo over and saw a name scrawled in faded ink. Evelyn. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow colder. A gust of wind blew through the attic, extinguishing the faint light filtering through the window. Thomas felt a presence, a suffocating weight that made his chest tighten. Bruno barked furiously, his body positioned protectively in front of Thomas. Before Thomas could react, the rocking chair began to move on its own, creaking rhythmically in the silence. The air filled with a faint whisper, a voice so soft it was almost indistinguishable. "Leave." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come." Bruno snarled, his teeth bared as he faced the rocking chair. Thomas took a step back, clutching the wooden box tightly. His mind raced with questions. Who was Evelyn? Why had his parents hidden this box? And what were they protecting him from? As the whispers intensified, the rocking chair abruptly stopped. The air grew still, and for a moment Thomas thought it was over. But then, the candles around the circle flickered to life, their flames burning an unnatural blue. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and converge, forming the outline of a figure. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She pointed at Thomas, her voice echoing in a chilling tone. "You shouldn't have opened it." Thomas stumbled backward, his breath quickening. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. Bruno lunged at her, barking fiercely, but his attack seemed to pass through her as if she were made of mist. "Protect him," the figure said, her gaze shifting to Bruno. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving only the flickering candlelight behind. Thomas sank to the floor, his mind reeling. He looked down at Bruno, who nuzzled his hand reassuringly. Despite his fear, he knew he couldn't ignore what he had just seen. The wooden box in his hands was the key to a secret his parents had tried to bury, a secret that had just begun to unravel. As Thomas stood and prepared to leave the attic, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever the box contained, it was tied to his family in ways he couldn't yet understand. And whatever danger lurked, Bruno had proven he would stand by his side, no matter what. With a deep breath, Thomas closed the attic door behind him, the box still clutched tightly in his hands. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of foreboding remained. He glanced down at Bruno, whose unwavering loyalty gave him a glimmer of hope. Together, they would face whatever came next. Unbeknownst to Thomas, the secrets of the attic were far from over. The house was unnervingly silent that evening, as if the air itself held its breath. Thomas sat on the edge of his couch, the wooden box from the attic resting on the coffee table in front of him. Bruno lay at his feet, his body rigid and his ears perked up, as though he were listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. Every now and then, the dog would let out a low growl, his eyes darting toward the hallway leading to the attic. Thomas couldn't shake the image of the pale woman's hollow eyes from his mind. Her words echoed relentlessly. "You shouldn't have opened it." He rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the fragmented puzzle of his family's past. The name Evelyn, the photo, and the vial of blood. It all felt like pieces of a horrifying secret. But what was the connection? And why did Bruno seem so determined to keep him out of the attic earlier? The room suddenly felt colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones. Thomas glanced toward the thermostat, but it was unchanged. The cold wasn't coming from the air. It was something else, something unseen. "Bruno," Thomas muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel that?" Bruno responded with a sharp bark, his body shifting as he faced the dark hallway. The tension in the room was palpable, as if some invisible force was watching them. Then, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft thud from above. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The attic. He knew that sound was coming from the attic. Bruno growled again, standing now, his body positioned protectively in front of Thomas. The dog's fur bristled, his growls escalating into sharp, warning barks. "Stay here," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. He stood, grabbing the flashlight from the side table. He didn't trust himself to switch on the lights. It felt safer to keep the shadows at bay with something in his hand. As he moved toward the hallway, the house seemed to stretch, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. The air felt heavy, each step requiring more effort than the last. The soft thud came again, this time followed by the faintest creak, like someone or something was shifting their weight on the attic floorboards. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was someone hiding up there? Or was it something else entirely? His parents' warnings to stay away from the attic now felt less like a precaution and more like an omen. When he reached the attic stairs, he paused, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Bruno barked furiously behind him but didn't follow this time. It was as if the dog knew better than to venture further. "All right," Thomas muttered to himself. "It's just an old house. Houses make noises. That's all this is. But even as he tried to reassure himself, his gut told him otherwise. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his skin prickled with an unshakable sense of dread. He ascended the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath his feet amplifying the silence around him. When he reached the attic door, it was slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered shutting it earlier. His hand reached for the handle, but a cold draft seeped through the gap, making him hesitate. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating the rocking chair, which was now eerily still. The circle of candles had been disturbed, their stubs scattered across the floor. And then he saw it, a faint trail of something dark leading away from the circle and toward the far corner of the room. Thomas stepped inside, his heart hammering in his chest. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, he was plunged into darkness. He slapped the flashlight, and it sputtered back to life, but the brief moment of darkness had unsettled him even more. As he followed the trail, he realized it wasn't just dust or debris. It was dried blood, leading to a trunk he hadn't noticed before. The trunk was old, its metal hinges rusted and its surface scratched. He knelt in front of it, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside was a tattered diary, its pages yellowed with age. Scrawled across the first page in bold, hurried handwriting were the words, "Do not open this book." Thomas hesitated but turned the page, his curiosity outweighing his fear. The entries were disjointed, filled with ramblings about a curse and unforgivable actions. One line in particular caught his attention. Evelyn was never meant to be born. She is the darkness we cannot escape. A loud crash behind him made him whip around, the flashlight beam catching the rocking chair as it moved violently back and forth. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling the room with an eerie cacophony. Thomas stumbled backward, clutching the diary to his chest. Bruno's barking echoed from below, frantic and unrelenting. He scrambled to his feet and bolted out of the attic, slamming the door shut behind him. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Bruno pressed against his legs, his eyes wide with fear. Thomas sank to the floor, his breath ragged. He clutched the diary, its ominous words etched into his mind. Whatever secrets his family had buried, they weren't meant to be uncovered. But now it was too late to turn back. Something had been awakened, and Thomas knew it wouldn't rest until its story was told, or its curse fulfilled. The house trembled with a presence that felt alive, oppressive, and vengeful. Thomas clutched the diary tightly, his pulse racing as Bruno growled at the attic door. The whispers were louder now, unintelligible yet menacing, seeping through the cracks like a poisonous fog. Every instinct in Thomas screamed to leave the house, but something kept him rooted. A desperate need to understand, to bring closure to this nightmarish ordeal. The diary's final pages held the answers. He flipped through them frantically, his hands trembling as he pieced together the fragmented story. Evelyn, the pale woman in the photograph, had been shunned by the family for reasons tied to the bloodline. She was born of betrayal, a forbidden union, and deemed a curse upon the family. The diary recounted how the family had sealed her fate in the attic, performing a ritual to contain her spirit. The vial of blood, Thomas realized, was part of the binding. Opening the box had released her. A piercing sound broke his thoughts, a deafening, guttural scream that seemed to echo from within the walls. The attic door burst open, slamming against the wall. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the house, extinguishing every light. Shadows pooled and shifted in the hallway, coalescing into a figure. It was her Evelyn. Her translucent form floated toward him, her hollow eyes locking onto his. Thomas froze, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey. Bruno barked furiously, leaping between Thomas and Evelyn, his teeth bared. Evelyn's form hesitated, her gaze shifting to the dog as if she recognized him, or perhaps remembered her connection to the family she had been forsaken by. Why? Her voice echoed, layered with pain and anger. Why did they abandon me? Why did they seal me away? Her words cut through the air, charged with sorrow and rage. Thomas swallowed hard, his voice shaky as he tried to respond. I don't know. I wasn't part of this. I didn't even know about you until tonight. Evelyn's expression twisted into something unrecognizable, a blend of anguish and fury. The house shuddered violently, books falling from shelves and glass shattering around him. Bruno barked louder, his body tense as he prepared to defend his owner. Please, Thomas pleaded, holding up the diary. I don't know what they did to you, but I'm not here to hurt you. Tell me what you want, and I'll help you. Evelyn's form wavered, her eyes narrowing as she approached. You can't undo what they've done, but you can suffer, as I have. The shadows lunged toward Thomas, cold and suffocating as they wrapped around his body. He gasped, feeling the weight of her torment pressing into him, her pain seeping into his soul. Images flashed before his eyes. Evelyn as a child, locked in the attic, crying out for help that never came. The betrayal of her family, the isolation, the despair. It was overwhelming, a torrent of agony that brought Thomas to his knees. No, he shouted, his voice breaking. You don't have to do this. Let me help you find peace. Evelyn hesitated again, her form flickering. For a moment, the rage in her eyes softened, replaced by something else. Longing, perhaps hope. Bruno barked again, stepping closer to Thomas, his unwavering loyalty a stark contrast to the abandonment Evelyn had endured. You were betrayed, Thomas continued, his voice steadier now. But not by me. I'm sorry for what happened to you. No one deserves that. But if you keep holding onto this pain, you'll never be free. Let me help you move on. Evelyn's translucent figure loomed over him, her face a mask of uncertainty. The shadows around Thomas began to recede, her form flickering like a dying flame. Move on, she whispered, her voice fragile. How can I? Thomas held up the vial of blood, the one he had found in the wooden box. This is part of what bound you here. Maybe it can set you free. Evelyn stared at the vial, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and longing. Free, she repeated, as if the word was foreign to her. Thomas stood, his legs shaky but his resolve firm. Yes, but you have to let go. Let go of the anger, the pain. You don't have to suffer anymore. The house fell silent. Evelyn's form began to fade, her expression softening. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For remembering me. Thomas uncorked the vial and poured the blood onto the attic floor. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting. Evelyn's figure dissolved into light, her presence dissipating into the ether. The house, once suffocating with darkness, now felt lighter, almost peaceful. Bruno wagged his tail, pressing against Thomas's leg as if to reassure him. Thomas sank to the floor, the diary still in his hands. He glanced at the final page, where new words had appeared in delicate handwriting. Thank you for setting me free. Tears streamed down his face, a mix of relief and sorrow. The nightmare was over, but the weight of what had transpired would stay with him forever. As he looked at Bruno, who now rested calmly beside him, Thomas knew one thing for certain. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be remembered, and through that, Evelyn's spirit had finally found peace. As Thomas sat on the floor of the now quiet house, the diary resting in his lap, a wave of emotion washed over him. What had started as an ordinary evening had turned into a confrontation with the past, a journey through pain, loss, and redemption. The house no longer felt hostile. Instead, it seemed to hum with a quiet relief, as though it too had been freed from Evelyn's anguish. He glanced at Bruno, who lay at his feet, his ever-watchful eyes filled with calm. You knew, didn't you? Thomas whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Bruno wagged his tail gently, as if to say he'd done his part. Thomas smiled faintly, realizing that it was Bruno who had sensed the danger, who had refused to let him walk blindly into the attic without understanding the gravity of what lay within. The experience had left Thomas with an undeniable truth. The weight of the past can bind us, but it doesn't have to define us. Evelyn's story was a reminder of how easily pain can fester when it is ignored, how injustice can echo through time. Yet, it was also a testament to the power of acknowledgement, of offering peace even to the most tormented of souls. Thomas looked around the room, the diary's final words etched in his mind. "Thank you for setting me free." He wondered how many other stories remained untold, how many restless spirits wandered, longing for someone to remember them. Perhaps, he thought, this wasn't just about Evelyn. Perhaps it was a lesson for him and for all of us about listening to the past, not to dwell on it but to learn from it. As he locked the attic door one final time, Thomas couldn't help but reflect. What other secrets might be hiding in the places we call home? What would we find if we truly listened to the whispers in the dark? What did you think of Thomas's chilling encounter and Bruno's unwavering loyalty? Paw Prints, do you believe the past can leave echoes in the present? Or was it something more? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Let's unravel the mystery together. Man Detective Sparkles. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to smash that like button, thumbs up, and subscribe bell to our channel for more spine-tingling tales that will leave you questioning what's real and what's not. Stay tuned because we have even more haunting mysteries and heart-pounding stories coming your way. And hey, if you've ever had an experience that sent shivers down your spine, let us know in the comments. Who knows? Your story might inspire our next video. Ghost Sparkles, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chilling chapter.